Thank you. Well, it had taken me 5 years to write it because I was working, I had a job. I was living in New York. I was working for a magazine, Vogue. And so I was writing this at night. And finally I got about halfway through it, and I realized I just couldn't finish it writing at night, because when you get halfway through a book, there comes a time when you have to concentrate on it and pull it together. And a couple of hours twice a week, that was basically what you have at night, because you've also got, you've got other obligations. You have to go. I mean, I was covering cultural events for Vogue, and so I had to go to a play or something. Was not going to finish this book. So finally I took a couple of months, 3 weeks or a month leave of absence or something, and went home to Sacramento and just typed it, finished the book. And so it was a big relief when it came out. I mean, it was a huge relief to me when it came out. Oh, I'd never written another book. Well, I mean, that book, when I was going to take the leave of absence, I needed some money to support myself for that month, right, or 2 months. So I sent it around to publishers, and I got turned down by 12 publishers. Yes, definitely there were rejections. But the 13th took it. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how anybody gets through that phase of being rejected all the time, but you do. I mean, it's just part of what you do, you know. I had always wanted, when I was in school, I had wanted to write novels, and so I hadn't thought of doing nonfiction. I didn't actually start. Then I started, after that book was published, I left Vogue and started writing pieces for magazines to support myself. And so then I put them, started putting those together. And sometimes you would hit a piece that seemed that it could take a longer length than a magazine could give you. And I think I might do a nonfiction book someday, but I didn't do one for a long time. I had an editor at, well, first he was at Ferris Strauss. Then he went to Simon & Schuster, and I went with him. And he died. He dropped dead in a subway station, at age 49 or 50. And I was so dependent on him that I thought I could never write again. I mean, I was devastated, and a lot of people who he edited, or I know several other people he edited, felt just as devastated at the time. I think in some cases it is, and it wasn't. Nobody understood really nobody understands what an editor does. I mean, an editor doesn't sit there with a blue pencil, but they give you the idea that you can do it. Somehow they transmit that to you without making it sound like some kind of dumb pep talk, but they believe in you. This was after Henry, yeah. Michael Korda at Simon & Schuster was my editor then, and now Shelley Wanger at Knopf is my editor. I had never covered domestic American politics. It simply was outside my whole interest range. I wasn't interested in it. Bob Silvers at the New York Review asked me to cover the '88 campaign, and I kept, in theory I knew it was something I should do, and in theory I was going to do it, but I kept putting it off. I clipped everything. I had files all over the house of every single clipping from every single newspaper we got on obscure days and obscure primaries, but I didn't actually do anything until June, when I had to go to California for some other reason, and Bob said, "Fine, then we'll arrange for you to go out with Jesse Jackson." And so I did, and then I did something with the Dukakis campaign, and then I did some other stuff, and then I did the conventions. But I had never ever been exposed before to the process of American politics. It was quite stunning to me. Well, it seemed to exist. It seemed to exist only to maintain itself. I mean, it didn't seem to have any relationship with the people who hung around gas stations. It didn't seem to connect with the rest of the country. And well, we saw that in a fairly dramatic way, over the past couple of years. I mean, we saw what became known as the disconnect became pretty clear. But this was, you could see the disconnect in a campaign. I mean, you could see it in a campaign very clearly, it seemed to me. Yeah, and it really wouldn't have mattered what the speech was. It wouldn't have mattered. I mean, the pressure wasn't on Dukakis so much. The pressure, the narrative was already in place. I mean, the candidate always makes, believe me, this summer it'll happen twice, speech of his life at that moment. Do I like the politics as it is covered? Yeah, I do. I always resist it still, and I don't do it very often. But when I finally get shoved into facing it, I do like it. The White Album, I think those pieces they're about the 60s, they're sort of late 60s, early 70s of the Beatles album, which was the album that it figured in the Manson trial. It was a kind of dark album, and a lot of this stuff. That was the period when, yeah, it was a really ridiculous day. Well, it was. I mean, it was. I mean, I don't know why I was so stunned in 1988 to see the number of staged events that were staged and totally for the moment, so that they would be broadcast, right? Because there it was, and Nancy Reagan was doing the same thing in her own backyard on 45th Street in Sacramento. She was pretending to pick flowers for the television crew, and it was exactly the same thing. Yes. No, I don't. I did it some when my last novel came out. And I think the time before that, when I did it, was a couple of books before that. I mean, I don't do it. I don't mind talking about it. I don't talk about anything that I haven't done yet. I mean, I don't talk about anything I'm working on or thinking about. Yeah, I mean, people want to know if a certain piece was the editor's idea or your idea. I don't know why this. I mean, because it really doesn't matter whose idea it was. It just is, because you wouldn't do it if an editor suggested something, if you didn't respond to something. But these were pieces that I was doing. Basically, I was living in Los Angeles, and the magazines I was writing for were in New York, and so I was reporting on a lot of stuff that they weren't seeing. So they were my idea. It comes from that Yeats poem, turning and turning in the widening gyre, when what rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born, which was something that had come to my mind when I was doing a piece in the Haight-Ashbury in 1967, and it seemed to me that it was that we were seeing the tip of something important that wasn't about quote-unquote hippies, that it was about disaffected children, etc. That was how it felt, though. I was in Los Angeles. I mean, it was that whole period, the 60s, were a whole. There was a lot of upheaval going on. I mean, besides the kind of obvious upheaval, there was a lot of social upheaval. I always thought at some level the 60s came out of the fact that we hadn't yet accommodated we hadn't really accommodated the end of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it was sort of, we started trying to do it in the 60s. And it was a lot of upheaval. I did a piece about Huey Newton, yeah. Jim Morrison, I did a piece on. Just called up somebody. I just went over to Sunset Sound, which is where they were recording, which was near where we were then living. It was, you know, you just, actually the hardest thing to do as a reporter, or I've always found, is make that call. But if you do make the call, sooner or later you're in the scene, you know. Yeah, I mean, I like to sit around and watch people do what they do. I don't like to ask questions. I don't particularly like to, I hate doing interviews. I mean, as the interviewer. I would rather just sit and watch people do it. So rock and roll people are in many ways the ideal subject for me, because they will just lead their lives in front of you. They will rehearse, they will play, they will do whatever they're doing. So that was perfectly easy. I never did a piece on Janis Joplin. I did know her. I mean, I had met her. She was a friend of some friends of ours. Eldridge Cleaver was basically running Huey was in jail. Eldridge Cleaver was basically the person you got in touch with if you wanted to see Huey Newton at that time, plus the lawyer. But yeah, he was living in San Francisco then. I think it still could happen. I mean, these were not that. These were not. I mean, these names now sound legendary, but they weren't legendary at that. They weren't legends at that moment, if you see what I mean. They were just people who were in the middle of a situation. Well, yeah, I did. Huey Newton was already a big name. Mm-hmm. That was the night of the Manson killings, the night of the Cielo Drive, which was the Sharon Tate, Wojtek Frykowski, and the other people who were killed at that house. We moved we'd been living in a house in Hollywood. It was a rented house. It was a wonderful old falling down house, which I don't know, it felt like that period to me. And then we moved out to the coast. We moved out to the far end of Malibu in Trancas, and it was a very different kind of life. I mean, it was just a new kind of life. We were living on the frontier, as it were. I don't know what impact they had on the United States. They were quite devastating in Los Angeles, because when it first happened, I think everybody tried to think that it was in some way couldn't have happened to them because they weren't those people, right? But it could have happened to anyone. It could have happened, and I think that by the time that the whole thing played out, I think that was what was so frightening and devastating to everybody. I remember talking. I interviewed Linda Kasabian, who was the driver on both nights that they killed, and the second night was, I mean, the picking of the address seemed perfectly random. It could have been anybody. I can't remember what year it was offhand. It was in the early 90s. No, that was basically, that was a different kind of thing. my interest in this was the case that became known as the Central Park Jogger, in case nobody remembers. But my actual interest in that case was in the reaction of the tabloid press in New York, and not just the tabloid press, the press in general, the way in which it accommodated certain sentimental ideas that New York had of itself. Whereas well, in a way, the Manson killings satisfied certain apocalyptic, certain local sentimental ideas. I mean, if there was a sentimental idea in Los Angeles in the 60s, it involved apocalypse. I had been going to write I had been interested because we had just moved to New York a few years before, and I really didn't understand it. I mean, I'd lived there when I got out of college, but I was back after 25 years in Los Angeles, and I didn't really quite get it. You know, I mean, I didn't understand a lot of things about why it was the way we were, the way it was. So I was going to do a series of pieces, reporting pieces in New York, and then I did this piece, and it went on for so long. I mean, I just got the whole thing, and then I lost interest because I sort of got it then. Yeah, well, they kept getting. I mean, nobody could quite get one of the defendants' mother, who was quite present at the time of the trials, because she was attractive. She was there. But everybody got her name wrong. Everybody spelled her name differently, and I don't think anybody spelled it the same way she spelled it. And then she was given a series of different occupations. You know, I mean, these are things that are pretty easy to find out if you just actually look into it. I mean, there was. I don't think this was a question of sloppy reporting so much. I think it was a question. It was one of those cases in which her story, whatever her story was, or how her name was spelled, didn't fit into the narrative that was being into the narrative of the story. There was a story in place, and she didn't in some way fit into it. I started writing when I was quite small. I mean, before I was writing stories when I was before when I was 5 or 6. Yeah, I was whining around about being bored or something, and she gave me a big 5 tablet and told me to go write something. And so I did. And it was an apocalyptic kind of story about somebody who was a woman who finds herself freezing to death in the Arctic, and then finally relief comes, and then heat comes, and then she realizes that she's now dying of heat in the tropics. Or it may have been vice versa, I don't remember, but whatever way it was, that this was a no-out situation for this woman. It was 5 or 6, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I don't. I don't know. I was probably the only 5-year-old she knew. My mother had been a librarian before she was married, but she was married when she was 24, so that was not. And then I was born, so she was home. I mean, at that time, and that my father. Well, it was during the Depression, so when I was first born, he was selling insurance, but he was also supporting, but nobody was buying anything. So he would support we would play poker and do stuff. You know, he was. Then during the war, he was in the Army Air Corps, and after the war, then he was. It was kind of a big boom time in California, and he was buying and selling real estate, basically. You know, buying real estate and selling it at a profit. And then during the Korean War, his reserve unit was reactivated, and he went back into and was an army. And I don't know what service it was at that point. I guess it was the Air Force. I have a brother, a younger brother, yes, who is the chairman of a commercial real estate company. I was mistaken. It's not irrelevant. Well, I mean, I learned that the same kind of family dramas afflict them that afflicted us. Have a child, talk to her friends. I mean, you know, watch. She's 30. She's in her early 30s. She's great. Quintana Roo done. Her father and I were in Mexico, not in Quintana Roo, but in another part of Mexico, and I was looking at a map, and I thought how beautiful this name was. It was still a territory then, and I'd never known anyone who'd been there. I mean, this was before all of the stuff, and so and not long afterwards, we adopted Quintana, and we call her Quintana. We slightly anglicized the pronunciation because it was easier for everybody. And we named her that. And it was this very romantic idea to me then, because it was terra incognita. It was totally it was a wild place. And then immediately after she was born, it became a state, and there was a Club Med. It was Cancun. Only archaeologists and herpetologists went there at that, you know, before. She's a photographer, and she's right now she's a photo editor at Elle Decor magazine. She puts up with it. Well, I mean, I think it's always a little. I think for anybody in your family, it's probably, I don't know, it's a little embarrassing to have a parent or a sister or a daughter out there being in public, you know, or saying things or writing down what she feels, or, you know, I think it's probably not an ideal situation for other people. She handles it beautifully. Oh, this was a piece I did, I think it was in 1965, and he already had had cancer. He was making a picture in Mexico called The Sons of Katie Elder, and went down, and he was, it was what writers call a set piece. You go onto the set, you write you write what goes on the set, and so I did, and it was, he was a sort of amazing, larger than life figure, and he was still larger than life, even sick. I still felt that about him when I met him. Ben is a friend. I mean, he's really a good friend. I mean, I adore him. Yes, he lives in California, but I first met him, he was working for the White House. He was a sort of junior speechwriter in the Nixon administration. We don't agree politically we don't talk so much about politics, actually, but I don't think we probably agree politically on. I hadn't been seeing the American Perspective. I had just read it a couple of issues back, and I sort of loved it. It sounded exactly like talking to Ben. Well, Eve, thank you. Eve used to come to that house, that old house in Hollywood. I haven't been back recently because my parents moved to Monterey in 1988, and my brother lives there too, and so that's where I tend to go instead of to Sacramento. I still have a lot of cousins in Sacramento, but I see them in Monterey rather than in Sacramento. The last thing he wanted was my plot novel. It was my novel about Iran-Contra, but I mean, it's very heavily plotted. It was so heavily plotted that I had to write it in one sitting. You know, I mean, I would lose the track of the plot if I didn't just sit down and do it. And if I went out to dinner, I practically lost track of the plot. It was a really quiet. Well, see, I'd been writing bits of it and doing parts of it, but then when I actually sat down to write it, I did it between the end of August and the end of December of one year, and so it was a very concentrated effort. It was a lot. It was fun, actually. It was a good way to work. And when I say it was my Iran-Contra novel, it just basically came out of all those events. I think that the nonfiction bleeds into fiction quite a bit. Although except in Miami, I had never actually written about Iran-Contra. But of course, those events were all, I mean, Miami was suffused with them at the time I was there, which was 1985. It came out in 87, but I was there in 85 and 86. I believe that Lucille Miller, she's served her term, and I believe that she is dead now. The daughters grew up. I've talked to one of them, and she's a lovely woman, and that's all I know. Well, crime stories do, for a reporter or a writer, they do give you a way into people's lives. I mean, I remember once I was working for. It's always been a problem for me to actually think of calling somebody up and saying, "Can I come into your life and write about you?" There has to be some public event for me to do it. I remember once I was working for Life for a very short time, and I was looking for. I said to the then managing editor, I would like to do such and such a kind of piece, but I couldn't find a way in. I couldn't find an event to take me into it. And he said, "Don't be ridiculous. You just call him up and you call up and you say, I'm from Life." But I couldn't quite do that. It was intrusive. I don't think anybody gains a great deal from having a reporter or a writer in their life. I think that I wrote a line once which a lot of people have misinterpreted, and it was in the introduction to Slouching Toward Bethlehem, and the line was, "Writers were always selling somebody out." And a lot of people took that, I mean, almost universally it was taken to mean that the writer is deliberately betraying that's not what happens. What happens is the writer sees the subject in a different way from the subject sees him or herself. People who are not public figures, people who have not dealt with public persona, generally don't have a very developed idea of what their of how they transmit themselves, of how they look to other people. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just is the way they get through, and whether the reporter is sympathetic to them and loves them, no matter what the report, no matter how positive the reporter's reaction may be, it is different from the way they view themselves, and that feels as if something has been taken away from you, your privacy, whatever. So yeah, so I find it intrusive to go into people's lives. Oh no, I didn't mean that it wasn't sloppy reporting. I think it was, but I didn't think that it derived. That it was I thought it was more than just sloppiness. I thought that it derived from basically having another story to tell, and she didn't fit into it. That's what, and then then they allowed themselves to get sloppy. Yeah, and it became this question of not naming the Central Park jogger became a huge issue in New York, and it was quite an ugly situation where she was named, actually. She was named in black papers. She was named on black, all through the black media in New York, the local black media. She was not named in the white media, which it was quite an ugly situation, and there was a lot of it seemed to me false righteousness on the part of whites about not naming her. In fact, I mean, I had a strong feeling about it. I had a lot of strong feelings about it, and one of my feelings didn't have to do with the white-black issue, but it had to do with, which was just this was an exacerbation of a situation it's always not very far below the surface in New York. But my own feeling about not naming her was that it, in a way, it reduced her humanity. What happened to her, the damage that was done to her was so much greater than the rape. I mean, she had, pipe shoved into her head, and she was simply brutalized. But it wasn't. It was much more than the rape, and this put all the emphasis on the rape. She was not named as a rape victim, right? And the other things were so much graver. No, I didn't write anything about it. I didn't actually go to Israel until much later, and didn't write anything then. My husband did. That was '82. Well, I went down because it was one of those situations where you were reading stuff in the paper and it didn't quite, the official statements on it didn't quite add up. And so we thought we would just go down and see what was going on. And I didn't come to any overwhelming conclusion about it, except that we were lying about it. I mean, except that except that the government was deluding it. The United States government was deluding itself about its role there. I mean, it was just a simple: you go down, you report. That's all I was doing there. It was a very straightforward book. Yeah, I did it for the New York Review. I did it. It ran in 3 parts, and I don't know whose idea it was, whether it was Simon & Schuster's or whoever it was. It was produced very fast. It was produced almost like a pamphlet. Oh, it was hardcover. I went down to El Salvador in June. These pieces appeared in the New York Review in the fall, and in the 1st of April, I think, the book was on the New York Times bestseller list. So it was a very fast it was a very gratifying thing to be able to write something topical and have it produced that fast. You know, that's one problem with the book business. It doesn't work fast usually. You know? It was discouraging. It was discouraging. And I mean, obviously, it didn't change. That was 1982. It was published in the spring of '83. We were still there. I mean, we were still. No, one aide to a congressman said to me when I was introduced to him a couple of years later, said that book was said Salvador was very useful to us at a certain point. But, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for calling. I think that I think people are responding to a certain directness of voice, which I seem to be able to manage a good deal better on paper than I do actually in person. I mean, I don't come across as a very direct person, but I try to be. I get direct on the page. I don't know. It's just I've just been. That's the place where you stay honest, you know, and where you talk. I mean, you always have a very specific. I don't mean a specific reader, but you have a very specific idea that you want to tell somebody something. That's why you're writing it down. You want to transmit this. This isn't in a vacuum. I'm not writing things on a piece of paper to be preserved in a safe deposit box. I wouldn't do it if nobody read it. It wouldn't. It's not for me. So you're aware of that. Hello, Sandy. How are you? Yes, yes. Oh, Sandy, thank you. I feel more comfortable. Yeah, I'll put them on. Well, in that sense, yeah. I mean, it's much easier. I'm not very threatening. On the other hand, it's very hard if you're in a certain kind of situation, people also don't take me seriously, so that's good if I just want to hang around, you know, and don't want them to notice me. But it would be hard if I wanted to interview them, say, if I wanted to command their attention and respect. It's very hard at my size. I haven't actually thought a great deal about that campaign. I may be thinking about it, you know, over the summer or something. But I'm not. But I've kind of been holding it at somewhere off in an anteroom. That piece I did on Martha Stewart. Well, I didn't interview her. I just wrote about the idea of Martha Stewart and the power she has over large numbers of, you know, I mean, not over, the way she transmits very directly. Well, I think part of it seems to me that what she's transmitting isn't what people think she's transmitting. People think that that she has all of these. The people are actually paying attention to the recipes, to the tips about making the Easter bunny for your table or the wreath or something. I don't think that's what people are watching her for. I think the people are watching her because she's successful, that she has somehow prevailed in a man's world, right? And I think she got out of the house. She built herself. When you read the web, there are a lot of websites devoted to her. When you read them over and over again, you see the same phrases. She got out of the house. She elevated. I mean, it's one of those. I think she fulfills a lot of people's actual desires. You know, I think it's a huge concern. Particularly the amount of non-information which just bombards us every day. On the other hand, outside the major media and I mean, I look at something like Salon, and then you find an amazing number of good pieces, and by younger writers who are really looking at stuff and thinking about it. And so I don't think all is totally hopeless. I do use a computer. Yeah, I learned to use a computer in 1987 to, basically as a typewriter. Basically because I couldn't get my typewriter fixed anymore. I mean, it became clear that I had to move on. I had an IBM Electric, yeah. But I was just using it as a typewriter until last summer when I finally, and I was using DOS. I mean, DOS made me so logical. I learned to write a whole different way once I started using a computer because it was so logical. I started thinking more logically. It really helped me a lot. I started writing a different kind of piece. What happened last summer was I had to go to Windows because DOS, you couldn't basically get that fixed anymore either. And when I went to Windows, I got a high-speed net connection, and so I now can actually use it. Well, I thought that when she originally talked about it, that she found it, I remember her saying there were too many options because you could work so fast in the computer that the options she couldn't, and I had a certain sense of that. Everything was arbitrary. This sentence, rather, the sentence done with this word rather than with that word, it was all arbitrary on the computer because you could change it so fast. But then I got over it. If you just, I don't think she ever worked through a whole book on a computer. I think it's much better, yeah, because it's much faster. And you're able to, the faster you work, the longer you're able to, the more sustained an idea you're able to carry through. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I edit constantly. But what I do is I print out all the time and scratch it up on and then just edit further. Well, they weren't written as connected pieces. However, if something, I mean, they were written as parts of each one of those was a part of a longer piece, and I just pulled them together. But obviously, the same person wrote them, and one person, me, pulled them together and selected those particular pieces. And so I definitely had something in my mind, but I never think about what it was. Yeah, it's startling. I mean, it was certainly startling to me when I first encountered it, because you just never think of your own work being used in a classroom. Classrooms are for Thomas Hardy, I think everybody's work is overinterpreted, but by which I don't mean those things aren't there. I mean, when I was in college, I was at Berkeley, and the English, and I was in the English department, and the English department at the time I was an undergraduate was very wrapped up in what was called new criticism, and new criticism depended on your basically over-interpreting everything. We would do image studies of house and garden imagery and Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, stuff like, stuff of water imagery. We do all that. And all that was there, but I don't mean, which isn't to say that Henry James put it there. But what Henry James has in his mind isn't accessible to him. What he wrote is an expression of something in his mind that he hasn't analyzed. You see, I mean, I think most writers don't analyze where the stuff they write down comes from. Helene was not based on anybody in particular. There are lines of Helene's that I sort of picked up. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and certain lines of hers were things I heard people say in different contexts. I think one of them was the line about the Laszlo. Was something I heard that a friend of mine actually said. But she didn't come from anybody in particular. Mariah came from nobody in particular, except I had an image in my mind. I'd seen somebody. I was in Las Vegas, and I had seen an actress who's, you know, sort of a young, I mean, not a well-known actress, but it was whose name I knew, was paged, and she was walking across the casino, and in a white dress with a halter dress, and so I started wondering about, you know, what she was doing there, etc. And but I never knew. But that was the that was the beginning of Mariah. Obviously, you're writing to no, I mean, I knew somebody was going to read that story about the. I knew my mother was going to read it, which is your first big audience, right? So you write to express something, and I mean, it's a double thing. But if nobody read it, it would be very difficult to believe that the expression was worth bothering with. You know, I have almost never seen anybody reading one of my books. I walk around, particularly, we used to go to Hawaii a lot, and every time I was on a beach in Hawaii, I would walk along looking for what everybody was reading on the beach, right? None of them were reading they were reading Robert Ludlum. They were reading everybody. Practically, except me. Over the years, weirdly enough, Slouching Toward Bethlehem sold the most, sells more every year. The novel that sold the most in terms of at the time of publication was Slouching Toward Bethlehem, I think. Not Slouching, Book of Common Prayer. This is a story about a woman. Well, it's kind of a complicated setup. It was one of my. But the basic character in it is a woman whose daughter has gone underground, and she ends up in a small country in Central America, mean little country. And she ends up being killed in a revolution. But it was like one of those 5-day revolutions. I mean, it was just a change. It was a coup. It was not a big. And it came out, that novel came out of a book, out of a trip I had made to Colombia. And it had nothing to do with Colombia, but there was this, the plane to Colombia, to Bogota, had stopped in the Panama airport, and I became very wrapped up in the idea of Central America. And then I got sick in Colombia, and so I had a lot of time on my hands just to do a lot of reading and focus on this idea. So it was so it came out of that. It had a lot of stuff from the 60s in it too. Pretty much all of them, yeah. Mm-hmm. Most of them have been translated into Spanish and Portuguese, but also German, also Japanese, less often in France. In fact, rarely in France. I only stayed was slightly longer than 2 weeks. My emotional reaction was really strong, as you can guess from the book. I really felt as if I was in shock the whole time I was there. When I said that it hadn't had any impact, I didn't mean that it wasn't read. I meant that it didn't have any impact on American policy in the situation. Yes. Mm-hmm. I did not like the book, no. I didn't object to the literary device in it. That wasn't my objection to it. I just thought that it didn't get very close to anything. I don't think it changed anything. Did it change the way you think about biography? I mean, I kept reading these things with the device being so, either so shocking or so revolutionary. The device didn't work. I mean, had the device worked, it would have been fine. But it didn't work. It was it was clumsily handled. You got to really know how to do those things, which I don't think he did. And it didn't. So that was the problem with it. No, I was sent the book for review, so I read it, and then I read the Roosevelt book, and then I read the Roosevelt book again, and then this was his previous book about Theodore Roosevelt, and I read it a second time because I thought maybe I'd just been skimming and missing something. You know, there must be more here than meets the eye, but there wasn't. Yeah, that was not a. There again is one of those cases when you read something and you think there must be more here than meets the eye, and probably I'm not getting it because I don't know really very much about the subject. And it wasn't until I started reading books of his where I did know quite a bit about the subject that I saw there was really not, that he hadn't really, in a lot of cases, thought things through. Oh, no. No. I mean, I get terrible reviews too, and I wouldn't. I mean, I never get in touch with the reviewer. No. I've had so many. I can't. I try to. I mean, if I were to dwell on them, it would make me furious all the time and keep me awake at night, and so I just sort of shove them off. But I do read them. Well, I want to go. I've written a couple of long pieces about California. I mean, they were kind of about the idea of what they were getting to was the idea of California, and so I want to do a third piece. So it's not a third piece, but I want to take those pieces and take them another step, and maybe make it into a longer thing, which would end up being a book. Democracy was written in 1984. It took me forever to write it because I wasn't using a computer, and it was a very complicated book, and I just kept getting to page 89, and then I would get discouraged and not know where to go, and so it took me so long it's usually a book, as you get toward the end, a novel, it will take off, and you'll be working very fast, and you will know that sooner or later, it's like, I suppose it's like being pregnant, sooner or later you're going to have this baby. Sooner or later this thing is going to happen. You're going to be finished. You can see it coming, you work toward it. I never felt that with Democracy. It's simply, I remember Graham Greene once wrote about a book of his that didn't take off. And it's a physical thing. It's just a resistant book right up till the very end. And this one was so resistant that when I finished it, I didn't think of it as finishing it. I thought of it as jumping ship or abandoning it. I just finished. I just wanted to be rid of it. I think what happened there is my whole schedule got thrown off because we moved from California to New York, which put me about 2 years behind. It took me that long to find out where I'd put things. I think that, I read so much fiction. When I was in school and later, that it would be hard to name, but the people I still read. I never start a novel without reading Joseph Conrad's Victory. I never start a novel without reading, and I carry it with me, and I carry the Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier with me. As far as nonfiction goes, Edmund Wilson did great reporting. There's a collection of his reporting called The American Earthquake, which is just the kind of thing you want to do. He just goes and looks at stuff and then writes about it. And Elizabeth Hardwick did really good reporting. And Mary McCarthy did good reporting. I mean, those are the people I was reading, you know, when I was starting out to do this. Well, I just read Frankie Fitzgerald's book, which is fantastic. I think Way Out There in the Blue. Yeah, it's the line from Death of a Salesman. It's really good. I wouldn't write anything about El Salvador now because I haven't been there. I mean, really, the book I wrote was really about American involvement there. It wasn't about El Salvador. It was called Salvador, but it was about our effort there, whatever that was at that moment. Well, what I thought that was I mean, I found it a very encouraging profile. This was a profile of by David Remnick of Philip Roth, and I found it really wonderful because sort of inspiring because he was still doing it. He was still working, believing that he was still working. I think everybody feels to some extent that there has been a decrease in the general ability to read some kinds of material. I don't think I don't think large numbers of people understand how to read fiction anymore. I think the general reader of fiction tends to read it to take the characters at face value. I mean, the knowledge that a narrator in a novel might be lying to you, for example, is now, it seems to have passed from that which was taken for granted at the time we all learned to read novels. I don't think it's taken for granted so much anymore. However, those people who still do know how to read really read. I don't think it's a lost cause. Well, I don't know. I mean, if you start reading through the stories, it's trying to analyze how novels actually work, as opposed to trying to figure out how they reflect the life of the author, which they don't. I mean, don't in a faithful way. I mean, when I said that I always read Victory, one of the things that continually just dazzles me about Victory is that this is a story. You aren't even hearing this story at first hand. You're hearing it, or at second hand. You're hearing a story. The story is being told to you by somebody who heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody else, and yet you become very. And despite that distancing from the story, you become very engrossed with this story of Axel Heist and his Tropical Belt Coal Company. But you're seeing it from a distance, which is very like the distance in real life. What I mean is he's not made totally clear to you. You're looking from over here, which is, I mean, but I don't. People don't actually get as excited. A lot of people don't actually get as excited about this as I do. Well, I grew up actually before the baby boom, and grew up with existentialism had just been introduced. So if you have read any existential philosophy, it's somehow it's easier to hold these. You don't get cynical. You just kind of hold things at a. I don't know. It's a slightly different turn of mind. I find cynicism is beyond me. I don't actually get cynical. I mean, it's not in my vocabulary. That's a whole interesting area, and it wasn't covered. It wasn't available. It was, well, for one thing, American reporters tend to go places that are nearby and where they know the language. This was and I think it was very hard to. I think that situation for a reporter would have been hard to penetrate. However, it did go. It's a blank spot in our on our map at this, in our historical map. I don't have any insight into that. It's one of those. It's just one of those little cultural mysteries. No, you're not involved at all. It's made by the foreign publishers. It's all done through your agent, and it's submitted, and then they do something or they don't do something. Lynn Nesbitt at Janklow and Nesbitt is my. Well, she sells things. That's basically what they do. I mean, she's a friend as well as an agent. I mean, she was John's agent for long before she was mine, and so we were quite close friends. Yes, my husband is a writer too. So basically, you complain to your agent. She's who you complain to. She's who you say, I want more money. She's who you say, get me out of this. We have, yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a job. It's sort of fun. I mean, we've been doing it basically it's how we've supported ourselves for a long time. So it's been good to us, and it's sort of fun to do. It's as a technical problem. It's nothing like writing. It's because you're making something that somebody else is in essence going to write, the director. But you can. So you're making suggestions. You know, so it's kind of fun. We were married in January of 1964. Oh, I don't have any facility with language. I mean, I use a thesaurus. I walk around the house trying to think what the word is. At least toward the beginning of something. I mean, it's a neurotic kind of thing. Then as you get deeper into it, into a piece or a book or whatever you're doing, the language becomes a little more fluent. It's almost like learning a new language every time. As far as teachers go, actually I had a great editor at Vogue who taught me to do things over. We did a lot. I mean, basically I was writing captions for Vogue, right? But they were very closely, they had to be a certain number of characters. We counted characters, not words. They had to be a block of text, exactly 30 lines long, and each line had to have 64 characters, say. That's a different kind of writing. It's very demanding. And she would say, I can remember she would have this big aquamarine ring. She'd get violently Xing out things, muttering action verbs. She was a great teacher. I mean, and Aline Talmy, she was the feature editor of Vogue. And everybody who lasted with her basically learned to write. I mean, well, I had really, there were people who influenced me a lot at Berkeley, but God knows they were famous for it. Less so in high school. I didn't actually like high school. I mean, it was a very tedious time of my life, I think. Yes, I was bored and didn't really like it. The piece that you mentioned, the Spur Posse piece, which was only nominally about the Spur Posse, it was about the end of the defense industry, I mean, about the crash of the defense industry in California. I mentioned that I'd done two pieces, and that piece was the first one. I did it for the New Yorker, and it was quite a long piece, but it raised more questions with me than I still had a lot of unanswered questions when I finished it. And then I did a piece for the New York Review, which took the same questions a little further. Now I want to just take them a little further still. That was just a visit to the water control place in Sacramento. I was dying to visit it, yes. I mean, I can hardly drive by a dam or a thing without wanting to see how it works. Yeah. Oh, yes. When I was at Berkeley, this was one of the things that impressed me most. I never got into this place. They had, and I passed it every day, it was a big shed off Bancroft Avenue, and it was inside there was a hydraulic model of San Francisco Bay, which they flushed a tide through whenever they wanted. I was so dying to go in and spend time with that model, right, and work it, but I never could get in. Yeah, well, we do. My notebook right now is a box. It has been for years. It's like an archive box, a file box, and I just throw notes into it. There got to be something too constricting about just carrying a notebook around and writing things down, because in the first place I couldn't read my writing anymore. I mean, it was just, so now I just type notes when I think of one and throw them in the box, and then usually I go through the box when I'm working on a novel several times, and something will jog. Clippings go in there too, all kinds of stuff goes in there, and sometimes sometimes in a novel you make yourself use all the threads you've thrown into the box in one way or another. I mean, it's you're making something out of nothing anyway, so you might as well give yourself some parameters. Get in a nuclear explosion, if that's one of the clippings. That's right. It was just, it was what I remembered. I mean, it wasn't. It's something. It had something to do with the emotional meaning of it. I mean, this wasn't keeping note. A notebook isn't like notes you make for a piece or during an interview, where you try to. You certainly try to put down only what's true. This is a different kind of note, and this has. There's a kind of thing that happens in your own life when you don't even know what's true and not true anymore. I mean, yes, you could figure it out, but but it doesn't make any difference because you're so wrapped into one version of it or another. I think you have. I think people can be made to be interested in anything if you find a way to tell it to them. The task is in finding the way to tell it to them, and in making it come alive for them. I actually reviewed her autobiography for the New York Review, and I found it to be a pretty consistent, to not be inconsistent with the piece I had done. Obviously, she's going through a terrible time now, and she's doing it gracefully, which is, I think everybody feels for her at this moment. That's right. Yeah, that was. I can't even remember. Maybe that was a different piece, was it? No, it was the same piece. The piece I'm talking about was a review of My Turn. Maybe I did Peggy Noonan's book at the same time. Oh, the book was out. I wanted to. Probably. If I had to reconstruct it, I would think probably that Bob Silvers had asked me to review Nancy Reagan's book, and I needed something more, some other way to come at it. I used another book there too. I used a book about Hollywood, a book of photographs of Hollywood, a brilliant book of photographs by Gene Howard. Columbia. We're running a war there, basically. No, I haven't. I haven't been down. This was a piece that began. The first line of it was, it was something along the lines of, or maybe this is it exactly. Am I expected to admire a woman who would burden her daughter with the name Quintana Roo Dunn? Well, after that, from there, where do you go? If my daughter's name was fair game in the first line. So that was, I mean, it was, you know, there were points in that piece. I admire Barbara Grizzuti Harrison. She wrote a fantastic book about growing up a Jehovah's Witness. I mean, it's so interesting, and so so I was sorry she felt so strongly about me, but it was but that you couldn't get too worked up about it since it was kind of over the top. Well, actually talking in public, so I had this experience, or doing it, and actually doing it is never as hard as actually getting there to do it. You know, I mean, the kind of waiting to do it, doing it, you know, the logistics of doing it. So actually doing it, you put your mind, you kind of engage your mind in a different drive and do it. But it's rather hard for me, actually, because I'm quite inarticulate. Truman, I loved Breakfast at Tiffany's. I mean, it was a perfect of what it was. You know, it was just, I really did like it a lot. There is a certain, it's a different, obviously it's a different. The experience of writing fiction is radically different from the experience of writing nonfiction. Nonfiction, you've got a bunch of stuff. You do the research first, you've got it there, and now it's a matter of shaping it, of getting it. It's like sculpting, you know. It's like making something out of granite. Fiction, there's a dread level, because you wake up every single morning with the idea that it's not worth doing it, and you're going to have to make up something out of nothing that day, once again, and until you reach that point I mentioned before, when it takes off, and for better or for worse, you're going to finish the novel. It's a big question every day whether this is worth, why you're doing this. It takes till about 5 in the afternoon. In fact, I go to work in the morning about 10:30. It's not until about 5 in the afternoon that I actually start hitting a rhythm where I get a page done. And the best time, then once you hit that rhythm, you can work maybe for another 2 or 3 hours, but until you get hungry. But it takes all day to just overcome fear. I have an office in our apartment. I just stay home. No, I've never written any place except home. Once when we had a small house suite and a new baby, we rented an office, but it didn't work out. It was just something that didn't work about going to an office. It's an extra bedroom, and it's got, without a bed, and it's got a bunch of piles of books and piles of papers, and it's not very orderly. And it's got some, you know, it's got a chair where I can go sit and do needlepoint if I get stuck, and it's got a bunch of stuff, you know. For the needlepoint, you can, it's sort of mindless. You can think, you can sit there and actually think, and yet you do it at a moment when you think you can't think, when you can't think of where you're sort of panicking, right? But you start doing needlepoint, and you think you can trick yourself into thinking I'm doing something useful. I'm working on this rug, right? But it's so mindless that you can actually find yourself, you can sort of sneak into thinking about something else. No, I haven't. I haven't ever worked in Mexico. I don't know why. I just haven't, maybe because it was so extensively written about that I felt that I couldn't contribute as much as anybody else could. I don't know. It just hasn't presented itself to me. You know, I've got more. At the time that piece came out, I got more mail on it than I ever got in another piece in my entire life. Yeah, but I still get migraine, not to the extent that I used to. I mean, I've learned how to control them a little better. There was a terrific book. I don't know if you've read it, by Oliver Sacks, a neurologist, who wrote a book called Migraine, and it was originally published by the University of California Press, and I think it's been, or a few years ago, it was republished with a new introduction in paper, you know, in trade paperback. I think you'll find it fascinating because it talks about the experience in a really familiar way. Yeah, you concentrate on the pain and you accept, you live with it. It's a learning to live with problem. Actually, the point in my life when I was working for Vogue, and this was a piece that had been assigned to someone else who hadn't delivered it, and it was already on the cover. The cover said, "On self-respect," and so I was asked to write a piece about self-respect, and it was and I would be able to sign it, right? Which most of my stuff in Vogue wasn't signed at that time. So I did it, and so I started, you know, thinking about it, and it was, you know, I just wrote what was in my mind, obviously. But it was, I do remember one thing about writing it, which was, because it had to be done so rapidly, I did the first part of it, the part that was in a form. You know, magazines are arranged in forms, and some forms close earlier than other forms. So the part of it that was in the well of the book, I wrote first, and closed that, and then a week later I wrote the ending, because that wasn't closing until a week later. So it was a totally under the gun kind of thing. But it you know, but it was something I felt. You change your ideas. I don't know exactly how, but it would hardly be worth living if our ideas didn't evolve. I mean, Mark Shore he taught a very small class in fiction writing, and it was considered a very special class to get into, and she's in the scary part. Yeah. Well, everybody feels they do. I was so scared in that class that I couldn't speak. I didn't speak for the entire class. I just felt too shy, you know, and too inadequate. It was just, I mean, I was a little shy, and this was so special a class that I felt totally incapable. Well, it's a very gradual, yeah, there's a very gradual. Also, at a certain point in your life, you decide you're not going to be shy anymore. I mean, I remember doing it when I was about 24, 25, simply forcing myself to go into some kind of situation that I was too shy to do, right? Because it wasn't, you know, it's all right for little girls to be shy, but it's not too cute in grown women. Well, it's, I mean, it's totally different because I'm in a different moment in my life. It's totally different, and in some ways it's, I mean, it all looks the same, more or less the same, but it feels different because I am at a different point in my life, and also I had been, when we lived in Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time in New York, naturally. I mean, you come in to do business or something and be there for a period of a week or 2 weeks. And so this is sort of like an extension. So I grew used to being in New York in a different way than I had been when I lived there just out of school. And this is like an extension of those visits from California. It's a long visit from California. You see, it wasn't really clear because Ronald Reagan was at the time governor of California, and he was being talked about for more political, you know, for higher office. And so they were very much worth a, this was written as, I think, as a column for one or another magazine. I mean, it's sort of fairly short piece. So it was a fairly obvious idea to do at the time. I carry cards in my bag, you know, just sort of white index cards so that I can write something down on if it occurs to me. It is. Write to me. I think they're going to give an address. Yeah, and then I'll send it to you. Thank you. Well, I don't know. I mean, any way you can learn to write is anything that forces you to write is. I don't think anybody can teach you to write except doing it. And if you get into a program that forces you to do enough of it, and with a teacher who is harsh enough, I mean, I tend to think that probably in an academic setting, nobody is as harsh as people are in a professional setting. I myself was probably better off at Vogue than I would have been in graduate school. But that's a personal thing. I mean, I don't think I had it in me to get as much, to take as much away from from a graduate program. I had wanted to do something about the American connection with the Caribbean basically ever since the Kennedy assassination. I mean, I started thinking, this was at a time when everybody was saying the wave of, we could see America, we could read America's future was being lived today in California. I didn't think it was. I thought America's future was being lived today on the southern border. Specifically, not so much the Texas border, but specifically the interface with the Caribbean and with Latin America. And so at some point when I became interested in the Cuban community in Miami, and went down and did this, spent some time there, and I still think that community is not very well understood, the extent to which it and Washington have fed each other's fantasies for basically ever since the exile began. I mean, it's a whole interesting thing. We saw a lot of it play out in the Elian Gonzalez story. Well, there were a lot of things that struck me, but one was that right there, it was one of the most potent exile ideas or myths had to do with saving children. There was, in the 60s, a lot of children were sent from Cuba to Miami under something called, it was run by the Archdiocese, by the Catholic Archdiocese of Miami, of South Florida. It was something called Operation Peter Pan, or Pedro Pan. And the children were being brought to Miami because there was a rumor in Cuba that children would be sent to school and to live in school situations, forced to go to school situations in the Soviet Union. So instead they were taken from their parents and sent to, or their parents actually ran to the airport to put them on planes to Miami. And in many cases didn't see them again for a long time. So this was a very potent story in the exile mind. So that was one thing. The other thing was it got politicized by all sides, you know, and it was just. I would love to have gone down and actually looked into it some more, but I couldn't. In terms of time, I was doing something else. I think I would be interested in knowing how many Cuban Americans. I mean, I think there's a whole feel like outsiders. I think there's now a whole lot of, well, there always has been a whole lot of spread of opinion in the community, but it isn't always expressed in public. You can't be disappointed. You're delighted when somebody gets it. I mean, when somebody responds and cares about it. Everybody took from that novel different things. Some people saw it as a romance, pure and simple. Some people were interested in the fictional tricks in it. I mean, I think it's sort of more difficult than it was difficult for me. Yeah. No, I actually, it's been a huge help. It's been a huge help both in getting support of every possible kind. I mean, financial support. Two people might not have had quite the nerve to try to support yourself just writing, right? If there weren't two of us, we always read it. It depends on different points in different projects, and depends on what. Yeah, and talk about it. We don't give each other ideas so much. He has certain kinds of ideas are more likely to occur to him, and other kinds of ideas are more likely to occur to me. But I mean, we're totally in sync at the time during the work process. Well, his best book is always the book he's working on. but True Confessions, The Red, White, and Blue, and then Monster, his last nonfiction book, was very. I did write that book easily. For one thing, I was teaching at Berkeley for a month or so during a hard time in it. I mean, during the time when a book either has to turn into, take off or not take off. And I was living in a room at the faculty club by myself all during the week. So it was a really good time I had a lot of time to simply, by myself, to simply concentrate on the thing. So it was really good. Nobody was calling me up. The character of Grace came out of a lot of things. Obviously some of her voice is mine, but I posited her somewhat older than I was at the time. Although that was one of those books that there was a famous thing of George Eliot saying that she'd begun some book as a young woman and ended as an old woman, and I felt that about A Book of Common Prayer. For some reason, it just took forever. But it was easy to write. I mean, it was easy to write in that sense. I had a lot of fun with it. It was a period in the 60s when I began to doubt the stories I had told myself, doubt the narrative. So if you don't have, a strong sense of what things are about, you can't write. I worked my way out of it, actually. I think I got out of it with Play It As It Lays. Because I started in that mood, and then I finished it, and immediately I felt better. Well, they're both friends, so I'm not going to. I mean, they're both. Denny especially, I'm crazy about, and Tom I've known since we were both babies. Everybody just knew each other, It's just one of those. I don't mean really truly babies, but I mean since we were, yeah. Mm-hmm. I just remember him coming to the first house we had in California. I think he was working for the Herald Tribune then, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think it's in the White Album. Is that possible? Do you mean what that particular essay tried to accomplish? Well, I don't know. It was just... I mean, I couldn't even say what I was trying to accomplish because the circumstances are so wrapped up in how as I explained them and being asked to do this, or having to do it in essence. And naturally, it expresses what I thought, but it's... But I was writing it in too much of a rush to have any actual intention for it, I think. Because they were all personal pieces as opposed to reporting. Sometimes I do, but I don't get email, I mean, because I can't bear to have things coming in onto my working screen, you know, when I'm working. Things that come in the mail, I'm always delighted to get, and I always mean to answer, but sometimes they pile up, like with a bunch of business letters and stuff. I mean, things. I don't actually correspond with anybody when I'm working, so I correspond with people at these erratic intervals, and so that's that I think the most, and then something else that did was totally out of the blue to me was sort of just a nothing piece. It was a review of Woody Allen that I did for the New York Review, and I got a tremendous amount of mail on that from I know there seem to be a lot of movie buffs out there, you know, one way or the other. Well, the last question first. I didn't realize that Pauline Kael had labeled me the high, but people are always saying angst about me so much that I actually am quite a cheerful person. But what happened to Lucille Miller is she went to prison, and then she got out of prison, and then I believe she later died. This was in some Dreamers of the Golden Dream. She was convicted of killing her husband, because she's the one who had to put up with me writing them. She and John, yes. He's a young writer. He's a friend of. He's someone. Actually, he's a little older than my daughter. Bret Easton Ellis, you know who he is, this American Psycho. Yeah. Who was having, a lot of trouble. He'd gone through a period on American Psycho where he was getting a lot of non-faith from his publisher, and so we talked about various, Well, I wrote fiction before I wrote nonfiction, so the voice I had was a fiction voice, and I don't know that what I noticed, the difference in the voices that I notice is my the voice I use in fiction, the voice that feels right in fiction has a lot. It's almost has a lot of rhythm in it. It's like the liturgy. It's like has a lot of repetition. Very simple sentences with very few clauses. In nonfiction, there are a lot of clauses and kind of densely. It gets denser and denser. In fact, I don't much. I'm not going to make it simple. It seems to me to take somehow you can get a lot more thought in. I mean, you can make it kind of come alive that way. Yeah, oh yeah, all the time. In fact, I mean, even as it appears in magazines, it is not even as dense as it went in, because quite often I will have to cut a sentence in half because it fills an entire column. But also, I mean, it's somehow I keep thinking that you could probably contain a whole piece. You could probably balance a whole piece in some sentences, which is sort of an interesting. I mean, it's sort of an exciting idea to me. I love Miami. It just feels. I feel kind of excited, as if anything can happen every day I'm there. How did I feel about Mariah? Well, I mean, Mariah was Mariah. I couldn't analyze how I felt about her. I mean, you know, she's there on the page. I can't really analyze how I feel about her. I love all of my characters.
You do.
Well, Mariah, I'm attached to. I'm attached to all of them. You know, all of the major characters. Nonfiction is different because you don't. You're at a distance from them. You're not. You wouldn't intrude that much, you know. So it's no, you don't become attached that way. I don't know. I'm not sure that I moved from right to left. Oh, well, I moved from what was. Yeah, I did. I think it happened during the after the Goldwater. I voted for Barry Goldwater. And then, and he wasn't given much support I noticed in California when I was out there, and the party didn't back him, and they then did back Ronald Reagan, which, as far as I was concerned, they had not done the right thing. So I kind of started moving then, and then I was, it made me feel good when I started. I don't think that I mean, I didn't have any. I was registered as a Republican until I wanted to vote for Jerry Brown for governor of California, so I registered as a Democrat. I wanted to vote in a primary. So that was. Well, I voted for him the second time. I didn't vote for him the first time. And the reason I voted for him the second time was I thought he was not only the luckiest man alive and he could carry that luck with him, but he was doing he was okay. I still think he could be elected to a third. I mean, obviously he could be elected to a third term if he could run. I thought Jeffrey Toobin's book was quite good, which I just read a couple of months ago, I guess. I thought it was quite solid and very interesting. The Isikoff book I thought wasn't quite straight in terms of where he stood in relation to the material. I'm not sure that I even know what direction it's taken. That's one of the things I want to get into. What a lot of people who live in California's complaints about California don't seem to me totally. I mean, for example, I keep hearing from everybody I know in Los Angeles about the traffic, right? But the traffic is, I mean, I was there 2 weeks ago. The traffic is not at 5 o'clock in the afternoon getting from Mulholland in East Hollywood to Santa Monica in half an hour seemed not terribly demanding. So I don't know quite. I think there's a certain dissatisfaction among some people in California with the way things are going, but what they mean by that, I don't know. Well, it has been ever since I went out there, but I mean, in '64, I mean, it's always been, everybody's been very involved in politics, but it's not very, it is rather more rhetorical than, some people are not rhetorical, some people are really keyed in, but the sort of road involvement is more shallow than deep, I would think. It has fallen off the American map. It always falls off the American map unless we're involved in it. And so, I mean, unless unless we have some kind of action there going on. But I don't. basically Salvador was about Washington more than it was about Salvador, and so I wouldn't dream that I could write a book about a Central American or a South American country in the absence. I mean, I can only look at it from the American perspective. I couldn't get inside the culture, I don't think, sufficient. I mean, I don't think that any American could. Yeah, it's just a little practice. You just do it. I mean, you just try doing it. You can do it. You can use it. You don't have to use he said, she said every time, you know, but you have to use them once in a while to keep the reader oriented. You just get used to the... No, her book is about the Caribbean. My interest was in the American interface, political interface with the Caribbean. I mean, the Caribbean per se is another subject, and it's Jamaica Kincaid's. You just have to try something else. You have to try. I mean, I don't mean try another. You have to try and write something else. Come at the task of being a writer from a different. I mean, you know, write another thing. Try to sell that. Then maybe you can see ways to rewrite or make the other thing, make the first thing work. I don't. It's not an easy thing to do. Well, it's practically one house. Yeah, lots, and I don't think it will ultimately be good for it, but we'll see. Would I ever read an entire book on a Palm Pilot? No, I wouldn't. But who knows? I would have thought I wouldn't use a computer too. Well, I say Slouching Toward Bethlehem only because it has a piece in it which the piece is about John Wayne, but that isn't the point. Is that the beginning of it takes place in Colorado Springs. Slouching Toward Bethlehem, they're all pieces that I wrote in the 60s. The main piece is about the Haight-Ashbury in 1967. After Henry, the main piece is about the New York City, the Central Park jogger, and then there are other pieces about California and about the White Album. The main piece is actually looking back at the 60s. It's about that whole period at the very end of the 60s in Los Angeles. Miami's about the exile community in Miami and its relationship with Washington. And Salvador is about the American assistance effort there in the 80s and its connection with Washington. That's my Iran-Contra novel. And you have to read it in one sitting because it's got so much plot. Book of Common Prayer is the Central American novel. It takes place in a country not unlike, I mean, it wasn't El Salvador. I'd never been to El Salvador when I wrote it, but it's a country not totally unlike. Run River is a really traditional novel. It was my first novel. I wanted to make it a little more, cut up the time sequence, but I didn't know how to do it well enough, and so basically I had to put it all back in a conventional frame. So it's a very conventional novel about it was about a hop grower's adulterous wife in the Sacramento Valley. But it's about a family. Democracy is, I think of as my novel about the fall of Saigon. It would be a good novel to read during this week because it's tied into all that film we've been looking at again on television. Played as It Lays is about someone going through an emotional crisis in Hollywood, an actress going through an emotional crisis. It's a book about white space. It's a very understated book. It's meant it to move fast, and it does. It's a less complex book in a lot of ways than the other ones. I should say about Democracy, by the way, it's about the fall of Saigon. I mean, I think of it as the fall of Saigon book, but that barely happens in it. It has to do with a murder in Honolulu. I don't know. I mean, I'm working on. I want to do this California thing, and then I'm sort of starting another novel. Probably, yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I'm lucky. Thank you.